Functions are incredibly important tools used by computer programmers. And in Python, they are pretty easy to define, especially relative to other languages. And the reason for this is because we don't have to define all too much except how many inputs a function will get, and then we can define what our function will actually return later on. And in this video, I'll be covering how we can define a function and how we can use Booleans in order to determine if some kind of number is a prime number. And so, for instance, Python may not have a built-in function we can use to determine whether or not a number is prime, but we can pretty easily define a function to do just that. And so what I'll do is I'll define first some variable x, and that will be the input of what a user gives. And something to also make sure of is that because input returns a string, we have to convert it first back into an integer value before storing it into variable x. And what I'll say is, tell me an int, I'll tell you if it's prime. And so now that we have received user input, what we're going to do is define a function. And where you place your function definition in MATLAB is critical, because you need to define your function in the lines before you actually call your function if you're doing this in a single file. And so in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to define a function by typing def, and the function name can be whatever you want within reason. And I'll call this function isPrime. And isPrime will take in one argument, and I'll call that argument n, and that's it. And so we finished our function declaration with the colon, and now we actually define our function like so. And so I will declare a list called a, and a will be from the range of 2 to n, because as we'll call, a prime number is any number that is only divisible by itself and 1. And I'll just put some code in here. Generates the list from 2 to n minus 1. And the next thing we're going to do is also make note that the number 1 is not a prime number. And that's just for me, because I forget that often. What I'm going to do next is declare a for loop, and I'm going to say for element I in A, if n modulo I does not equal, so I should probably have a space, does not equal 0, return true. And in Python, true needs to be with a capital T, else return false. And so let's walk through what this is doing. And so what this does is we already know that every number, every element, that integer that exists is divisible by 1 in itself. But what we want to check is if there are any divisors of that number that have a remainder of 0. And so in that case, that's what this line does here. And so we iterate through each element in the list A that we defined, and if our remainder does not equal 0 for all of the elements within that range in the list A, then we can return true. And you can return many different data types in Python. In this case, I'm returning true, which is a Boolean. And so the cool thing about that is it kind of helps us write more condensed code. And so what I'll say is, if is prime, and we'll pass to it x, we'll say print, and we have to convert x into a string, and we need the concatenator. We'll say is a prime number, and we can then say else, and then we would say print string version of x is not prime. And so let's test this code and see if it actually works. So we're going to run it, and I love the number 13, so we'll say 13, and it successfully recognized that 13 is a prime number because 13 is only divisible by 1 in itself. Now let's try a number that isn't prime. If we run it again, how about we try something like 4, because 4 is divisible by 2. This code successfully recognized that, and we do not need to worry about our code being flawed. So, and the other thing, because I defined range to be from 2 to n, it will also successfully recognize 1 as being not a prime number. And so this concludes how we're able to use and define functions in MATLAB, as well as a nice little intro to Booleans and how Booleans can help us condense our code here. You could add a few more lines, which is never a direction you want to go, but we can return integer values here, or we can return strings. And if you return an integer or a string, what we could say is like if is prime returns some other variable type, then we could go through these statements. But this is a nice condensed way of doing it, and I hope you guys find this useful. Let me know if you have any questions, and thanks for watching.